So everyone, will get started now. Thank you all for coming here. Welcome to the Conference on the Perennial Philosophy. I want to begin by thanking the people who contributed their funding to make this conference work at all. Let me go grab my booklet. So if you go to the booklet, you can see the sponsors listed here. I want to read them out loud because I'm so grateful for their help. There's the Department of Theology at Notre Dame. And by the way, I'm Brad Malkowski. I teach in the theology department at Notre Dame. Then there's the Monastic and Religious Dialogue group. This is an international group. They were big contributors to the conference. Then the Faculty Research Support Program at Notre Dame. The J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning at St. John's University. The List Lecture Fund. The World Religions World Church Program at Notre Dame. And finally, Lumen Christi Institute of Chicago. All these people came to our rescue when it looked like we may not have a conference at all. So anyway, yeah, so thank you to all of those people. And thank you for those people who have come here in person from near and far. It's wonderful to see you all. I'm looking forward to meeting you all here. I want to now add a few more things. I'm going to list 5 things that I want to tell you about just before we begin this first session, things about the conference. As you know, as most of you already know, we were going to have 21 speakers, but now one of them is not able to be part of this, Philip Zaleski, because he's not feeling well. He was going to Zoom in. His wife, Carol, will be Zooming in anyway. She's one of the speakers. So we have 6 people presenting on Zoom and maybe 5 now. So, but most people are going to be giving their talks here in person. The second thing is this, and I'm not happy about this, is that if you look at the list of speakers, there's about 20 of us now. Only 2 of them are women. I'm sorry about this. I did my best to try to find speakers who are well-known scholars of both religion and the perennial philosophy, and I had a hard time locating the people. And I located some who either did not respond or almost decided to come, and then they couldn't make it after all. So I really did try. But we're fortunate to have 2 excellent scholars here, female scholars. That would be Catherine Cornell and Carol Zaleski. So that's what happened there. I also had hoped that we'd have some Buddhists here to present, and I thought I had one committed, very famous person. I'm not going to name names. And that person was decided that he was not able to come after all. And then there's another person, I know I'm being very vague here. There's another person, a very famous Buddhist monk who I thought would be coming, and then he decided not to come either. So we face those setbacks in addition to other ones that I'm not going to mention. Okay. The other thing you'll notice here is that we don't have a lot of time for each of the presentations. I gave everyone 20 minutes, and finally I stretched it to 25 minutes, and a few will have 30 minutes, because I wanted to find enough time for people to ask their questions, to have a lively discussion, if possible, at the end of every session. And the reason why we're having this difficulty with time is because I had originally thought this would be a 4-day conference. But after inviting everyone, I was advised to make it a 3-day conference, which means we have to cut back on the amount of time people could use to present their talks. But I think it'll still go well anyway. And that's all the things I wanted to mention. So we're going to get right to it now. We have 3 speakers in the first session. Our second speaker, we're waiting to hear from him, who's Zooming in, we hope, from the UK. That's Stephen Taylor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend about 5 minutes now introducing the 3 speakers for session 1, assuming that we can get Stephen Taylor to Zoom in. And if not, then I might jump in and move my talk from the second session to the first, and maybe by then Stephen will be available to present in the second session. We don't know what is going on. So right now I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers, assuming that Stephen Taylor is coming. The first one will be Dr. Adnan Aslan, who's sitting over here to my right. He was born in Turkey, educated in both Turkey and England. For many years, he taught philosophy in various academic institutions in Turkey, culminating in his position as Dean of Humanities and Social Science at Süleyman Şah University in Istanbul. He subsequently taught in our philosophy department at Notre Dame, and he now teaches at Respect Graduate School in Pennsylvania. Along with published journal articles and invited book chapters, Dr. Adnan's best-known work is Religious Pluralism in Christian and Islamic Philosophy, The Thought of John Hick and Syed Hossein Nasr. That appeared in 1998. A few years before, in 1994, while living in the UK, Dr. Aslan did something very unusual. He was able to get John Hick and Syed Nasr together in the same room, and he asked them a bunch of questions that became published then at the end of his book that I've just named. So that was quite interesting to read all about that. One last thing. When Dr. Aslan taught here at Notre Dame, and he doesn't know I'm going to say this, when he taught here at Notre Dame, he was a very popular lecturer. One of my students told me he learned more wisdom from Dr. Aslan than from any other teacher at Notre Dame, and that's after he took a course from me. He said that about him. Okay, and now I'll introduce Dr. Stephen Taylor. He's a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. He's also the chair of the transpersonal psychology section of the British Psychological Society. His 13 books include Waking from Sleep, The Fall, Out of the Darkness, Back to Sanity, The Calm Center, and many more. His books have been published in 20 languages. He writes blog articles for Scientific American and for Psychology Today. Dr. Taylor is currently researching what he calls awakening experiences, when people experience a temporary expansion and intensification of awareness. Eckhart Tolle has described his work as, quote, an important contribution to the shift in consciousness which is happening on our planet at present. Dr. Taylor lives in Manchester, England, with his wife and 3 young children, and we hope he will be presenting on Zoom very shortly. And then finally, our third speaker, also sitting here up front, is Dr. Alireza Ziarani, a native of Tehran, Iran, and a graduate of the University of Toronto, Canada. Prior to leaving for the private sector in 2009, he was a professor at Clarkson University in Potsdam, New York, where he taught engineering and science and led a biomedical engineering research program supported by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. His academic achievements won him the National Science Foundation's prestigious Career Award and multiple teaching awards. Alongside his professional activities, he maintains an active interest in the perennial philosophy and writes from a universalist perspective. His 2020 book, Philosophy of Science in the Light of the Perennial Wisdom, co-authored with Dr. Mahmoud Bina, has been translated into French, Spanish, and Persian. He currently resides with his wife in Bloomington, Indiana. So there's your introduction of our 3 well-known speakers. And I'm going to begin by inviting Dr. Adnan Aslan to come forward to give his talk now. Can
I take this?
Yes. He says, hold it. He says we want to be able to see you.
Okay. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, scholars, dear respected friends, I'd like to thank from the bottom of my heart to Professor Bradley Malkowski, who organized this conference alone. At the beginning, I was trying to help him, but I wasn't so much helpful, unfortunately. But I know how it was difficult, and he managed to organize alone this very important conference. So I'd like to thank him, also thank to him about the good words he told me about me. So my title of my talk is Perennial Philosophy Possible? It is always conventional to start with a definition. Perennial philosophy is defined as the world's great religious traditions are all expressions or crystallizations of a single saving truth. Katzinger, which offers an alternative worldview to the modernity. That is my addition. So I am trying to elaborate my point proposition by proposition. First proposition, perennial philosophy is a vision for the future of humanity and a possible way forward for the world system. Friedrich Hegel, in his Phenomenology of Spirit, states, the bud disappears when the blossom breaks through, and we might say that the former is refuted by the latter. In the same way, when the fruit comes, the blossom may be explained to be a false form of the plant's existence. For the fruit appears as its true nature in the place of the blossom. The ceaseless activity of their own inherent nature makes these stages moments of anorganic unity, where they not merely do not contradict one another, but where one is as necessary as the other, and continues thereby the life of the whole. This analogy represents a historical human adventure to reach modernity. Fruits represents modernity as the final destination of human existence. Other phases of humanity, let us say agricultural societies, may represent buds which have to disappear to give existence to organized religions, which represent blossoms. Blossoms had to disappear eventually, giving rise to the fruits. That is the modern society. The linear, progressive development of history is the principle of human adventure on earth. The task of the whole, that is history, is to bear fruit. Fruit is modernity. Humanity has reached this stage, a stage which signifies the end. That is not, of course, the end of humanity. It is the end of the final stage of the progress. Francis Fukuyama rightly declares the end of history, responding to the claim that religion and nationalism can produce an alternative to the world system. He states, I quote, a religious believer, for example, seeks recognition for his particular gods and the sacred practices, while a nationalist demands the recognition for his particular linguistic, cultural, or ethnic group. Both of these forms of recognition are less rational than the universal recognition of the liberal state, because they are based on the arbitrary distinction between sacred and the profane, or between human social groups. For this reason, religion, nationalism, and a people's complex of ethical habits and customs, more broadly culture, have traditionally been interpreted as the obstacles to the establishment of successful democratic political institutions and free market economy. Fukuyama himself professed that his thesis was based on Hegel's and Marx's notion of linear progressive history. If we accept a claim that religion cannot produce universally recognized rationality, and hence it cannot produce an alternative to the liberal capitalist democratic culture, then perennial philosophy is not possible. Again, I repeat. If we accept the claim that religion cannot produce universally recognized rationality, and hence it cannot produce an alternative to the liberal capitalist democratic culture, then perennial philosophy is not possible. Let us look at other side of coin. Arnold Toynbee, in his book Civilization on Trial, states, quote, if religion is a chariot, it looks as if the wheels on which it mounts towards heaven may be the periodic downfall of civilization on earth. It looks as if the movement of civilization may be cyclic or recurrent, while the movement of religion may be on a single continuous upward line. The continuous upward movement of religion may be served and promoted by the cyclic movement of civilization round to the cycle of birth, death, and birth. On the other hand, American sociologist Talcott Parson, in his introduction to Weber's Sociology of Religion, wrote this: Weber's primary interest is in religion as a source of the dynamics of the social change, not religion as a reinforcement of the stability of society. That is Durkheim. The prophet is above all the agent of the process of breakthrough to a higher, in the sense of more rationalized and systemized cultural order, an order at the level of religious ethics, which in turn has implications for the nature of society in which it becomes institutionalized. From these two quotes, I understand that there is no one single linear progressive human history, but there are many civilizations. Religion plays an indispensable role in the rise and the fall of civilization. According to Weber, religion is a source of dynamics of social change, whereas the prophet is the agent of more rationalized and systematized cultural order. I do agree with Fukuyama in rather different way. Modernity, to be specific, the capitalist liberal system represents the end of history. However, in the light of both Toynbee and Weber, I claim that the capitalist liberal nation state does not characterize the final phase of human history, but it denotes the end, maybe the termination of the Western civilization, which started with the Enlightenment, advanced with the scientific and technological development. If Toynbee's notion of history, Weber's vision of society are correct, then philosophy of perennial philosophy is not only possible, but also plausible. I repeat, if Toynbee's notion of history, Weber's vision of society are correct, then perennial philosophy is not only possible, but also plausible. So, second proposition, perennial philosophy is a rational philosophy. Let me briefly summarize a philosophical vision of perennial philosophy. The first thing one has to say that perennial philosophy is that it assumes the precedence of ontology over epistemology. It means that reality was essentially given by revelations. It envisages a hierarchical concept of reality. At the bottom exists the inanimate matter. Generally, the sciences examines the observable portion of that reality by dismantling it. Physics deals with the lifeless matter, while biology examines living creatures. On the other hand, chemistry concentrates on the transformation of matters, while astronomy explores the heavenly bodies, etc. The sources of the scientific knowledge are sense perception, experiments, and reasoning. In this framework, philosophy was situated above the science since it unites the existence under the name of being. The source of philosophical knowledge are reason and experience. When a person voluntarily relates the existence to God through faith, then theology enters into the picture. The sources of theology are revelation, reason, and the history of particular religion. Above theology, mysticism was established since it assumed a personal relationship with divine through spiritual experience. The sources of mysticism are spiritual experiences and reason. In perennial philosophy, divine being was considered as the source of all kinds of existence, whether spiritual, material, animate, and inanimate. Modern epistemology has caused a great paradigm shift in the nature of knowledge. Schumacher illustrates well the change of Western man's interest from the slanderous knowledge that may be obtained of the highest things, that is Thomas Aquinas, the mathematically precise knowledge of the lesser things, there being nothing in the world, the knowledge of which would be more desirable or more useful, that is Christian hygienes, marks a change from that we may call science for understanding, science for manipulation. The purpose of the former was enlightenment of the person and his liberation. The purpose of the latter is power. Knowledge itself is power, said Francis Bacon. And Descartes promised man to become masters of the possessors of nature. In its further development, science for manipulation almost inevitably tends to advance from the manipulation of nature, that of the people. As it is the case, when the modern sciences are subordinated to wisdom, no harm can come of it. However, when wisdom disappears in the field of sciences because people cease to be interested in its pursuit, the cost would be heavy, causing environmental problems. As Schumacher stated, quote, "The science for understanding saw man as the made in the image of God, the growing glory of creation, hence in the charge of the word, because nobility oblige. The science for manipulation inevitably sees man as nothing but an accidental product of evolution, a higher animal, a social animal, an object for study by the same methods by which other phenomena of this world were to be studied." Proposition 3, perennial philosophy offers an alternative culture. The claim of the perennial philosophy to be an alternative culture which potentially embodies an answer to the problems of modernity can best be understood when one seriously considers its potential to integrate individuals into society as well as into higher levels of reality. It can do so because it believes that all existence is a manifestation or point on continuum of hierarchically ordered reality. In such a vision, there is no room for dualism of psychological and cosmological kind, which has been real source for alienation. Hence, individuals, according to their level in communication with the higher consciousness as the source of reality, can move towards the more sustained awareness of unity. The unity is all-encompassing. Unity within society as well as with humanity, unity with all creations, finally aiming at the final unity, that is unity with ultimate reality. The intellect, which is both divine and human, and revelations that actualize the intellect are two indispensable means on path of unity. As Eisenberg and Thursby argue, the modern world has come into being through a process which has, at least on the surface, eliminated some of the sacred characteristics of the traditional culture. The 18th century Enlightenment managed to shift the interest from traditional values to the scientific values, which concentrated on the autonomous reason and technical progress. The historical and cultural experience of the 20th century, especially of 2 world wars and the destruction of community values, accompanied by the unseen consequences of the unbridled technology, has made people start to question the very foundation of modern values. As has rightly been observed, neither anti-intellectualism nor a sentimental traditionalism have been able to produce the means of integration necessary to take us beyond the contradiction that threaten to destroy us. Proposition 4, perennial philosophy is a candidate to comprehend human being as a whole. Let me start with a quotation from Karl Jaspers. Quote, "Physiology studies him as a body, psychology as soul, sociology as a social being. We know of man as nature, which we investigate as we do the nature of other living creatures, and as history, which we know by critical sifting of tradition, by understanding of the purpose pursued by a man in his thought and actions, and by elucidation of the events on the basis of the motives, situation, natural realities. Our study of man has brought us many kinds of knowledge. but not knowledge of man as a whole. Our study of man has brought us many kinds of knowledge, but not knowledge of man as a whole. I consider this as a confession of the failure of the modern disciplines in their comprehension of human being as a whole. In this context, it is right to ask, is there any discipline or any approach which is able to know human being as a whole? It seems to be obvious that Western civilization, especially in its modern educational institutions, has developed little interest in exploring the spiritual dimension of humankind. Such attitude is not because the Western civilization does not want to search for it, but it is because she has lost a required tool which leads to such spiritual dimension. The result was tragic. Schumacher tells what I have in my mind. Quote, naturally, those of us who have no personal experience of this higher level cannot imagine it. And the language those who are trying to tell us about it either means nothing to us or appears to indicate a disordered mind, even madness. As Sayyid Hussein Nasr points out, to be human is to know, also to be transcendent oneself. In the Hadith, Prophet says, "Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbahu." Whoever knows himself knows his Lord. According to Islamic tradition, self-knowledge is prerequisite of moral and spiritual development. The purpose of the earthly journey of an individual is to obtain a self-knowledge and to reach the peak of his or her humanity through spiritual practices. Religion is for that. As stated, the human being, even in full maturity, is obviously not a finished product, although some are undoubtedly more finished than others. Again, Schumacher, I quote, traditional psychology, which saw people as pilgrims and wayfarers on this earth who could reach to the summit of the mountain of salvation, enlightenment, or liberation, was not primarily concerned with sick people who had to be made normal, but with the normal people who were capable of becoming and indeed destined to become supernormal. Proposition 5. Perennial philosophy offers a serious criticism to modern science. The whole encompassing nature of perennial philosophy could also be seen in its dealing with modern science and technology. The main criticism of perennial philosophy to modern science are related with its independence, purpose, and secular characteristics. First is science gains its legitimacy from its own nature, does not depend on particular tradition, religion, or external principles. According to perennialists, such characteristic of science is problematic. Science and the other human endeavors, such as art, literature, philosophy, have to produce by relying on the revealed principles which were embodied in the various traditions of humankind. So, here, secondly, it is not possible to fix a particular purpose for science. It determines its own course. No one could predict where science and technology are heading to. No artificial intelligence can even master creative process, including making visual art, writing poetry, composing music, taking photographs. Cosmologist Stephen Hawking, in his one of the BBC interview is 2014, even warned that artificial intelligence could end mankind. I quote, he says, "The development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of human race. Once humans develop artificial intelligence, it will take off on its own and redesign itself at an ever-increasing rate. Humans who are limited by slow biological evolution couldn't compete and would be superseded. So the possible answer, a quote from Sayyid Hussein Nasr, he says, quote, although science is legitimate in itself, the role and the function of science and its implication have become illegitimate and even dangerous because of lack of a higher form of knowledge into which science could be integrated, and the destruction of the sacred and spiritual value of nature. To remedy this situation, the metaphysical knowledge pertaining to nature must be revived, and the sacred quality of giving back to it once again. In order to accomplish this end, the history and the philosophy of science must be reinvestigated in relation to Christian theology and traditional philosophy of nature, which existed during the most of European history. Proposition 6, this is the last proposition. Perennial philosophy is one of the most convenient methods of studying religion. The perennialist claims that perennial philosophy can potentially be a proper ground for the study of religion because it is able to give full consideration and appreciation of each religion's sacred qualities, since it believes that the sacred is the highest value. However, in the theological circle of the West, the potential of the perennial philosophy has not been explored fully. That is because, according to Nasr, quote, in no domain, in fact, is the shortcoming of secularized mind trying to grapple with what is really beyond its scope and power more evident than in the field of study of religions. A shortcomings which has already been their effects for the certain schools of Christian thought and very disturbing consequences for the religious life of those who have been affected by it. In this respect, perennial philosophy seems more appropriate than any other approaches, whether phenomenological, ecumenical, scientific, that have been developed in the secular atmosphere of the post-Enlightenment West. The potential of the perennial philosophy for the study of religion has not yet sufficiently explored. According to Nasr, traditional metaphysics alone is able to see each religion as a religion and the religion, absolute within its own universe, while reconfirming that ultimately only the absolute with a capital A is the absolute. Perennial philosophy has been criticized. So one of the most important criticism was put forward towards the perennial philosophy is that the claim of Stephen Katz, who declares that there is no philosophia perennis, Huxley and many others notwithstanding, in his article entitled as Language, Epistemology, and Mysticism. He says, the single epistemological assumptions that has exercised my thinking that there are no pure, unmediated experiences. Houston Smith responded Katz by saying that the claim of perennial philosophy is not that mystical experiences are cross-culturally identical. It is claimed do not appeal to the experience at all, save in the trivial sense that everything that enters our awareness can be said to be an experience of some sort. Perennial philosophy does not turn on the assessments of the mystical phenomena at all. Logically, it doesn't even presuppose their existence. Aldous Huxley says the core of perennial philosophy is doctrines. The doctrines derive from the metaphysical institutions, and it is To these, that perennial philosophy appeals. The second criticism leveled against the perennial philosophy is that, considering the doctrinal conflicts of the great traditions, how one possibly claim a transcendental unity of religion? Hinduism and Buddhism teach reincarnation, whereas Christianity rejects it. That Christianity and Islam affirm the soul, whereas Buddhism negates it. That Christianity exalts the Trinity, while Judaism and Islam renounce it. That Judaism and Christianity and Islam propose the creation, whereas Taoism and Neoplatonism prefer emanation. Houston Smith reflects the response of the perennialists by saying that here, though the relevant point is that important as these differences are in respect that are about to be indicated, they are not ultimate. Red is not green, but the difference pales before the fact that both are light. No two waves are identical, but their differences are inconsequential when they measured against the water that informs them all. As Sean said it, the unity or unanimity of the world's wisdom traditions is not to be found in the human atmosphere, but in the divine stratosphere. Third criticism directed against the perennial philosophy is that if the perennial philosophy is a serious philosophical alternative to the modernity, why do academic institutions take into the consideration seriously? Sean replies such a charge by saying that the reason is that I am not relativist. Today, all the scholars are relativists, and I am absolutist. I believe in truth, and the official scholars do not believe in truth, says Philosopher Sean. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience, and thanks for listening to me.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure and honor to be here today to speak about science and the perennial philosophy and to try to offer an answer to the question that forms the title of my speech. That is, does modern science provide us with the keys to plenary knowledge? Before I begin, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of the conference, especially Professor Bradley Malkowski, for making this event possible in spite of all the challenges that came their way. I would like to begin by directly addressing the question posed by the title of the conference, namely, whether perennial philosophy is still relevant in our time. Perennial philosophy is meant to be the enunciation of the timeless truths which underlie all the divinely instituted traditions. Now, either the Philosophia Perennis is real, in which case it is by definition independent of time, or else it is not real, in which case it has always been illusory. Therefore, to ask if the perennial philosophy is relevant in an epoch is to ask whether it is real. This question ultimately resolves itself into the question of the reality of the permanent and universal truths. If there are eternal truths to which man has access, at least potentially, then their enunciation, the perennial philosophy, is real, and consequently it is relevant in all epochs, including our own. It is this fundamental question to which I would like to offer an answer here on the level of principles and in the context of science. Backed by its technological achievements, modern science appears as the de facto source of truth to the majority of our contemporaries. Its sole reliance on reason and empirical data gives it an air of objectivity that has practically conferred upon it an almost incontestable authority. Typical of contemporary dynamism, scientism seeks everywhere to advance the inconstant suppositions and findings of modern science as the criteria of truth, effectively casting doubt on the reality and permanence of universal truths. But let us dare ask, against the backdrop of the pervasive scientism of our time, is modern science capable, at least in principle, of providing us with a knowledge of reality? To find out, let us examine the foundations of knowledge and the explicit as well as implicit premises of modern science. Let me note first that science, or knowledge, cannot be defined. For, in order to be able to define an object, one would first have to know what the object in question is. Thus, a definition for knowledge would imply prior knowledge of knowledge itself, which would end in vicious circularity. This means that no formula can be given to decide what science is or is not. Accordingly, to limit science to a particular type, such as empirical science, is logically unwarranted. And to call unscientific all forms of knowledge that do not fall within the purview of the scientific method is arbitrary. Any body of knowledge is entitled to be called science, we noted. Does this mean that all types of science are of equal standing as regards their worth? Let us examine this matter. Logic demands that the axioms of a system of thought should be consistent. Otherwise, a statement and its negation will both be derivable from those axioms, effectively rendering the system useless. A doctrine that does not enjoy logical consistency is thus null and void, conveys no knowledge, and has no scientific value. Therefore, logical consistency is the indispensable condition of all science. Moreover, a system of thought that sets out to treat a subject matter should be capable of sufficiently accounting for the things that fall within its mandate. Otherwise, it will not fulfill the goal that is set for it. Therefore, science worthy of the name must be adequate in its explanatory power. This constitutes the second criterion of science. It must be capable of providing us with sufficient knowledge of reality. Science necessarily involves a subject that knows and an object that is known. Two foundational questions about science are thus the following. 1, what are man's faculties that enable him to know? And 2, what can man, in principle, know? The answer to the first question constitutes epistemology. The answer to the second constitutes cosmology, ontology, and ultimately metaphysics. We perceive the objects of the physical world by means of our sensory faculty, and we reason with our rational faculty. Sense perception, which we share with animals, and reason, which is uniquely human, are two faculties of knowledge that modern science readily acknowledges and makes extensive use of. Mental faculties other than reason are either conceived as derivatives of the rational faculty, or else are conceived as its modes and of the same substance. These assumptions constitute the epistemological premises of modern science. The object of knowledge for modern science is often the physical world, which is knowable through sense perception aided by reason. When reality is extended beyond the realm of the physical, in modern psychology, for instance, it is thought to encompass the reality of the empirical ego, but nothing higher or deeper than that is ever explicitly recognized as real. These assumptions constitute the ontological premises of modern science. Since sense, perception, and reason are truly faculties of knowledge, and since the outward reality of their respective object of knowledge, often assumed to be the physical world, is hardly contestable, there is no reason not to consider modern science a mode of knowledge. The question remains, however, as to whether the science is capable of providing us with plenary knowledge of reality. To find the answer to this question, we will need to examine the plausibility of the epistemological and ontological premises of modern science. I will first treat epistemology, where we will need to ask whether man's faculties of knowledge are indeed confined to sense perception and reason. Reason cannot function in the void. It cannot, in and of itself, prove the truth of its methods. And it cannot guarantee that it can prove the truth of all that is true. Let me elaborate. A logical system can never be constructed in the void and always has need of a foundation. There are, first of all, undefined notions that are intuitively understood but remain undefined. There are, in addition, propositions that are to be taken as axioms. Finally, there must be some rule of inference to put these axioms into motion, so to speak. Logic is a useful tool for the coordination of mental activity and for effective demonstration. But in itself, it is not the source of truth, because reason cannot function in the absence of premises, the truth of which falls outside its scope. Reasoning alone cannot arrive at truth, because man would not be able to recognize the truth arrived at as truth if he did not possess the essence of this truth a priori. Reason is thus inherently limited as an agent of the discovery of truth, and moreover, it points to this limitation itself by the very fact that, in order to be able to function, it needs to take the truth of its premises for granted. Moreover, logic does not claim to give us a full account of truth by its own means. On the contrary, careful use of reason in mathematical logic, for instance, makes it clear that it is incapable of doing so. Rationalism, the claim that reason is the criterion of truth, is not rationally provable, and as such will have to be taken for granted outside any reasoning and in direct contradiction to its very thesis. Rationalism, therefore, must be distinguished from rationality. Rationalism seeks to confine man's faculties of knowledge within the bounds of reason. It is the illogical exclusivism of reason, not the use of it. We noted that man's rational faculty points to its own limitation. It thus indicates to man that there is something deeper in him than reason. In the words of Meister Eckhart, there is something in the soul which is uncreated and uncreatable, and this is the intellect. This deep-seated faculty, the immortal element within us, according to Plato, is what allows man to recognize and acknowledge the truth of all that is true, that of a logical demonstration, for instance. But the very capability of reason to point to its own limitation and to point to the intellect shows that it takes its light from this limitless source of which it is merely a reflection on the limited plane of the mind. Every man has access to eternal ideas such as truth, goodness, and beauty, which are inscribed, as it were, deep in his spirit, in the intellect. The very fact that men communicate with one another through the use of language and understand each other is indicative of the existence of common universal truths, to which all men have access. The very fact that some present theories in the expectation that others will accept them is indicative of their tacit assumption of the universal intellect, even if their theories be the very antithesis of such an assumption. The intellect is what endows man with objectivity. Man's intelligence is objective because every man can recognize the truth independently of his own subjectivity, thanks to his access to that universal repository of all eternal truths, which is the intellect, or, in the language of religions, thanks to his deiformity, his being made in the image of God, which precisely constitutes his primordial nature. As regards our cognitive faculties, the primacy of the intellect is thus evident. But the higher form of knowledge informed by the intellect is a thing nearly forgotten and categorically ignored in modern science. By its unwarranted restriction of man's faculties of knowledge to sense, perception, and reason, modern science has practically limited the object of knowledge to the physical world. Accordingly, realities that go beyond the realm of the physical, from suprasensorial or immaterial beings to absolute reality, are arbitrarily left outside its purview. And as Fritjof Schuon notes, this is precisely what renders modern science blameworthy from an integral perspective, necessarily metaphysical and symbolist, that accounts for total reality. Modern science is thus radically inadequate in its explanatory power when it comes to full knowledge of reality, and scientism, which claims that modern science is all-embracing by the very fact that it recognizes nothing outside modern science as valid, is moreover inconsistent, precisely because its very thesis is not supported by modern science and has to be taken for granted as a dogma outside the scientific method. Let us recall that logical consistency and adequate explanatory power were the two criteria I proposed for science worthy of the name. We just saw how modern science and scientism fare in the face of these two criteria. To wit, modern science is inadequate in its explanatory power, and scientism is moreover inconsistent. The finite can never comprehend the infinite, and yet every man can conceive of the infinite. Man could not know the infinite or the absolute were a direct ray of the absolute not present in him. And that divine ray is the intellect. And this shows that the most sublime object of his knowledge is the absolute, and that man's ultimate reason for being is the consciousness of the absolute, which is possible only through the ray of the absolute in him. True knowledge is the knowledge of the truth through the truth, as the sun is known through the sun itself, according to the Sufi saint, Dhunnun al-Misri. Realization of this state, the mystery of union or identity, goes beyond the plane of the human mind and engages all of man, who is not only intelligence, but also will and love. It therefore consists of truth, way, and virtue, metaphysical doctrine, spiritual method, and moral quality, the constitutive triad of all Orthodox religions in general and all authentic spirituality in particular. In contrast to modern science stands the perennial wisdom of the world's great religions that for millennia have offered humankind not only the keys to supreme knowledge, but also the means of attaining it. Thanks to that divine spark within him to which no limit can be ascribed, man is made for eternity. The drop of eternity that man carries within him endows him with eternal truths that can never be totally lost due to contingent facts of temporal circumstances. Truth is always truth, whether we accept it or not, and man, made in the image of God, always has access to it in his deepest being, at least potentially and in principle. It is to these eternal truths, largely forgotten in a world dominated by scientism and unbelief, that the exponents of the perennial philosophy in our time, preeminently Frithjof Schuon, recall, for the sake of those who are still moved by truth, goodness, and beauty. One cannot consistently deny the absolute. This timeless truth is inscribed, as it were, in man's spirit and is the very foundation of all knowledge. The timelessness of the truth of the absolute guarantees the reality of its enunciation, the perennial philosophy precisely, and its relevance, now and always. Thank you.
Hi, welcome. Hi, everybody. Apologies that I can't be with you in person for this wonderful occasion. I'm here in Manchester, in England, where I'm presenting my talk on what I call soft perennialism. Let me begin by sharing my slides with you. So yeah, in this presentation, I'm going to suggest that that perhaps a new approach to perennialism is needed, an approach which moves away from the traditional perennial philosophy as we know it, into a more kind of experiential focus, a more phenomenological approach. And I've called that soft perennialism. I've written about it in 3 or 4 papers. But in this session, I'll just present a brief outline of my arguments. So I think one of the traditional criticisms of the perennial philosophy is that the philosophical and conceptual doctrines and traditions, and teachings which underpin religions are too different to be compatible. And this is one of the arguments which Richard Jones has made in great detail, for example. There are such vast differences between traditional Christianity and Tibetan Buddhism or Taoism that it seems difficult to hold that all religious traditions are expressions of the same fundamental principles and are all leading in the same direction towards the same goal. It's also difficult to hold that all concepts of an absolute are expressions of the same fundamental absolute. The God of fundamentalist Christianity is massively different from Brahman of Hindu Vedanta or the Tao of Taoism. And even, different esoteric traditions, esoteric contemplative traditions are markedly different. For example, the Kabbalah or Tantra or Tibetan Buddhism. They even at that esoteric level, there are significant differences in terms of doctrines or practices. So it's therefore difficult, I think, to speak in terms of a common core of teachings across traditions. Now, I think these are traditional criticisms which contextualists or constructivists make, and I think to some extent they are valid. But this doesn't, I think, invalidate perennialism per se. What it does, it sort of questions the philosophical background of perennialism. So in view of this, I think that perennialism possibly needs a new focus, a focus away from the doctrines of religions and spiritual traditions towards the experiences of individuals within those traditions, and also the experiences of individuals outside traditions. I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. So this is the basis of what I call soft perennialism. And yeah, it's another term for a similar approach is essentialism. Essentialism in the sense of focusing on experiential commonalities within the experiences of mystics. So soft perennialism accepts that the doctrines of religions and spiritual traditions differ in significant ways, but it holds that there are significant commonalities in mystical experiences as they are described by individuals associated with different traditions, and also in the ways that traditions conceive of a developmental process of refining, expanding awareness towards an ideal developmental state. The differences in mystical experience are largely in terms of interpretation and conceptualization rather than in phenomenology. So this is why I use the alternate term perennial phenomenology rather than perennial philosophy. So in this sense, soft perennialism doesn't pay so much attention to the conceptual and philosophical aspects of traditions. It doesn't make the same grand metaphysical claims of traditional perennialism. It focuses on mystical experiences and how those experiences inform maps of spiritual development as described by traditions. And in these areas, we find a great deal of commonality, much more than in the doctrines of religious and spiritual traditions. And what one very important aspect of my approach is that there is a strong focus on mystical experiences that occur outside traditions. For me, this is the biggest single issue with contextualist arguments. They almost always speak of mysticism within the context of a particular tradition. And if you do this, you can argue that mystical experiences are constructed by that tradition. But what about when mystical experiences occur outside traditions? When they occur to people who don't know anything about traditional spirituality, people who may even consider themselves atheists? And also, what about when mystical experiences happen to children who are too young to absorb the conceptual outlook of their particular traditions? So in this presentation, I'm going to treat mystical experience as a human experience that happens to both the religious and non-religious. I see mysticism as part of an expansive range of human experience that can be explored and interpreted from different perspectives. In my view, different traditions interpret experiences and explorations of the landscape in terms of their own metaphysical systems. But it's almost as if they're people standing at different vantage points overlooking the same landscape. They obviously see the landscape in slightly different ways, but there are obviously some commonalities within their experiences, within their interpretations, because they're obviously seeing the same landscape. But it's significant that we don't have to explore this landscape from the standpoint of different religious or spiritual traditions. We can explore it in a more neutral way, without adhering to a particular metaphysical system. So let me just move on to the next slide. So as I summarize, this is just a brief summary of what I've mentioned, that soft perennialism has a strong focus on the experiential core of traditions, and therefore it has a phenomenological approach. And there is a strong focus on extra-traditional spiritual or mystical experiences. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. But let me just introduce two important terms which I'm going to use in my presentation and which I've used throughout my research. I tend to use the term awakening experience rather than mystical experience, partly because I've done a lot of research on these experiences amongst the general population, and many members of the general population don't really understand the term mysticism. They associate the term mysticism with esoteric or kind of magical thinking, strange phenomena. So I use the term awakening experience just to describe an intensified state of awareness in which we transcend the limitations of our normal consciousness and attain a fuller and deeper experience of reality. And in this sense, awakening experiences are temporary, lasting for a few seconds, before a return to normal awareness. I also use the term wakefulness to describe a stable, ongoing state of intensified awareness. And I guess, this would be equivalent to the way that some people use the term enlightenment. When somebody becomes enlightened, they attain a stable state of a wakeful or a fuller, expansive awareness. So there are obviously different degrees of wakefulness. Some people may attain a lower intensity of wakefulness. Some people may attain a very high intensity of wakefulness. And it can occur gradually through spiritual practice. But I found in my research, I've done a lot of research on a phenomenon which I call transformation through turmoil. That's when people who go through a great deal of psychological turmoil suddenly undergo a shift into a more expansive state of awareness, which is equivalent to a form of spiritual awakening. And then it becomes a stable, ongoing state. And if you think about it, most spiritual traditions have equivalent terms to this. They have terms for a temporary state of awakening and also an ongoing state of awakening. And in keeping with my emphasis on mystical or awakening experiences outside traditions, it's important to note that even a state of stable, ongoing wakefulness can occur in a non-spiritual context, outside the context of spiritual traditions, even to people who don't know anything about spirituality in a traditional sense. And I'll explain a bit more about that later. So now I'd like to explain why I believe that contextualists are wrong, even though I think they have a point in terms of the lack of commonality in religious doctrines and religious goals and paths. I think they are still completely wrong when it comes down to experience. I think there are 4 reasons why it's necessary to think in terms of a perennial phenomenology. There are 4 experiential commonalities which are too significant to be dismissed by any contextualist arguments. So let me explain these 4 reasons. First of all, if you look into mystical experiences, both within traditions and outside traditions, there are very significant similarities. Many scholars have analyzed mystical experiences belonging to different traditions and found significant commonalities between them, no matter how far apart they are in terms of culture or time. One example is Ken Rose. I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work. He compared the guidelines to meditative practice in Theravada Buddhism, Patanjali's yoga, Catholic mystical theology, and found significant overlaps. He said that they describe virtually identical sets of mystical experience induced by deepening concentration. Similarly, Randall Studstill, he compared Tibetan Buddhist Dzogchen teachings and medieval German mysticism of Meister Eckhart and others. And he found, the same kind of commonalities, arguing for the essential unity of mystical traditions. Studstill used the term mystical pluralism and described how different mystical practices disrupt the processes of mind that maintain ordinary egocentric experience and induce a structural transformation of consciousness. So all of the different practices were devised towards the same end, to disrupt ordinary consciousness and allow a more expansive awareness of reality, despite the different conceptual and doctrinal differences associated with those traditions. And in my own research as a transpersonal psychologist, I've collected hundreds of reports of awakening experiences, which are equivalent to mystical experiences. I'll give you one example. In 2017, with a co-researcher, we collected 91 examples of awakening experiences, and we analyzed the content of the experiences, the characteristics of the experiences. We also analyzed the contexts or triggers associated with the experiences. And we found that of 91 awakening experiences, 37 were associated with psychological turmoil, such as stress, depression, loss, bereavement. And 23 were associated with contact with nature. 21 associated with spiritual practice. 15 associated with reading spiritual literature or listening to spiritual videos or talks. So, it was a surprise that so many of these experiences were induced by psychological turmoil or associated with psychological turmoil. It was also a surprise that so few, 36 out of 91, were associated with traditional spirituality. And in fact, we found that most of the people who sent us reports of these experiences didn't have a background in spirituality. They would not identify themselves as spiritual people. Most of the experiences occurred quite randomly or spontaneously in the midst of everyday life. And people would not have described them as spiritual or mystical experiences. So to me, this offers evidence that these experiences do have an extra traditional context. They can and do frequently, if not mostly, occur outside the context of traditional spirituality. This is important because in terms of the contextualist argument or the constructivist argument, it's important because, you know, there is no tradition that constructs these experiences. Even, you know, you might say that maybe it's a wider cultural context which is informing these experiences, but most of these experiences occur to people in secular cultures where there is no kind of spiritual or even religious background to inform the experiences. So this invalidates constructivism as far as I'm concerned. We also, as I've said, we looked into the characteristics of the experiences. These were the, excuse me, these were the primary characteristics in order of frequency. So the most prominent characteristic was positive affective states, peace, joy, sense of harmony, and so on, followed by intensified perception, sense of aliveness, brightness, energy, light, so forth. Then it was the next frequent characteristic was a sense of connection or oneness to others or to nature, followed by love stroke compassion, different time perception, general knowing or awareness, and so forth. I'll just give you a moment to look over those characteristics. But you can see that these characteristics, although they've come from a secular context to people who would not define themselves as spiritual in any normal sense, they're essentially the same as the characteristics of mystical experiences as identified by Walter Stace, by Richard Jones, Paul Marshall, most other scholars of mysticism. So we are clearly dealing with genuine mystical experiences here, even though they're not related to traditional religious or spiritual contexts. The second reason why we need to think in terms of a phenomenological perennialist approach is because if you look into the process of awakening as it is described across traditions or outside traditions, we see the same basic characteristics that unfold in the process of development. I wrote a book called The Leap, the Psychology of Spiritual Awakening, and I analyzed many different spiritual traditions, Taoism, Sufism, mystical Christianity, mystical Judaism, and so forth. And I found that they share 7 essential conceptions of the process of awakening, the experiences involved in the process of awakening. I don't have time to go into these in detail, but I'll briefly summarize them. So there's a process of intensifying awareness, a movement beyond separateness towards connection and union, a process of cultivating inner stillness and emptiness, a movement towards increased empathy, compassion, and altruism, developing increased inner stability, self-sufficiency, and equanimity, the relinquishing of personal agency, a movement towards enhanced well-being. So all these characteristics were shared by every spiritual tradition in their concept of what awakening or what spiritual development means. There are obviously certain differences in the way that traditions conceptualize these characteristics. Some are more important than others in certain traditions. For example, the collective altruistic aspect of awakening is strongly emphasized in Jewish and Sufi mysticism, while the cultivation of equanimity and self-sufficiency is strongly emphasized in Buddhism. At the same time, the aspect of relinquishing one's personal agency is strongly emphasized in Taoism. So these characteristics are emphasized to different degrees. There are 1 or 2 more significant variations too. For example, although almost every spiritual tradition places emphasis on union with some sort of absolute spiritual principle, this doesn't feature in Theravada Buddhism. But Theravada Buddhism places more emphasis on cultivating equanimity and selflessness than on attaining union. but the overall similarities are striking. So returning to my earlier metaphor, it's as if these depictions of awakening are explorations of the same landscape of expansive human experience. The third factor why we need to think in terms of soft perennialism or experiential perennialism, and also why the constructivists cannot be right, is what I call extra-traditional wakefulness. This is when certain people experience an ongoing state of wakefulness and without being connected or influenced by any particular tradition. And there are lots of different cases of non-traditional mystics who experience an ongoing state of mystical awareness, but they didn't have any background in spirituality and their outlook was not informed by any particular mystical tradition. Some typical examples, I've got two examples here. D.H. Lawrence, who you may be familiar with, the great English poet and author. Walt Whitman, the great American poet. Neither Lawrence or Whitman were connected or influenced by any particular spiritual tradition. I think Whitman in later life found out about Eastern spiritual traditions, but they didn't inform his spiritual wakefulness as it manifested itself in his writings. Same with Lawrence. Lawrence didn't know anything throughout his life about Eastern spirituality, Eastern mysticism. But if you read his poetry or Whitman's poetry, you see clear signs of people who are spiritually awakened, people who experience a constant sense of union with reality, people who experience a constant sense of heightened awareness and an intense feeling of connection to other human beings. And there are some other examples. There's another great English nature mystic called Richard Jefferies, who described himself as an atheist, but was a very powerfully developed mystic. Also, the American social activist Peace Pilgrim, who some of you may have heard of. She was a naturally awakened person whose wakefulness expressed itself through social activism. But in my own research, I've done a lot of research, a lot of work on a phenomenon which I call transformation through turmoil, which I mentioned earlier. Transformation through turmoil is when people go through intense trauma, intense suffering of one form or another, often due to bereavement, sometimes due to a diagnosis of cancer, sometimes due to a long period of depression, sometimes due to stress or disability or addiction. But sometimes people who go through these extreme experiences undergo a sudden identity shift. It's as if the normal ego, the normal self dissolves away under the pressure of the turmoil, and a new self arises like a phoenix from the ashes of the old self. And this new self exists in an awakened state. It has a sense of connection, has a heightened awareness, heightened perceptual awareness, and there's an intense inner feeling of well-being. And you know, the characteristics of spiritual awakening are manifested in these people, although they, in some cases, they don't know anything about spirituality. In some cases, they feel a little bit confused by what's happened to them because they don't have a kind of spiritual context to explain what's happened. This is the main focus of my recent book, Extraordinary Awakenings. And often, in retrospect, people gravitate towards spiritual teachings, spiritual books, or spiritual groups in order to make sense of what's happened to them. And you know, they eventually perhaps identify as spiritually or as spiritual people. But at the time when the experiences occur, there is no influence by any kind of spiritual context. And that's important because it means that these cases can't be explained in constructivist terms. Finally, my fourth reason why we need to think in terms of a perennialist phenomenology, and also my fourth reason why constructivism is false. This is childhood spiritual experiences. As you may be aware, childhood spiritual experiences have been frequently reported, perhaps even more frequently than adult spiritual experiences. Two examples of that are the books in the slide here. Edward Hoffman's brilliant book, Visions of Innocence, Edward Robinson's The Original Vision. These are both collections of mystical experiences which occurred during childhood. And according to Edward Robinson's research, most of these experiences occur between the age of 5 and 15. That's 70%. And Edward Hoffman found something similar, that 77% of his 123 experiences occurred between 5 and 15. But also some occurred before the age of 5. 23% in Hoffman's book, in Hoffman's research, occurred before the age of 5. Alistair Hardy's research at the Oxford University Religious Research Unit has found that childhood and adolescence were the most common frequencies of religious experience. So these statistics tell us that mystical experiences, spiritual experiences are extremely common during childhood. But the problem for constructivism here is, how can young children, in some cases below the age of 5, how can a mystical tradition or religious tradition construct an experience in a young child? Young children, particularly below the age of 5, they are too young to absorb a conceptual outlook from their culture. They are kind of in a pre-conceptual state. So you can't explain these experiences in constructivist terms. And also, similarly to the other experiences I've described, many of these children didn't come from any religious background. Their parents were not religious. In some cases, they were from a completely secular background, but they nevertheless had powerful mystical experiences. Let me just give you a brief example. This is one I collected from my own research. This was a Scottish man who was describing an experience he had at the age of 6. And what happened was that one morning at the weekend, he ran out of his house to play with his friends. And suddenly, as soon as he ran outside his house, everything changed, everything shifted. This is how he described it. He said, "I looked at the telegraph pole outside of my friend's house, 4 doors up. It was pulsating with life and energy. The road surface was the same. I was made up of the same pulsating energy. I lay down, looked up to the sky, and then just felt the oneness of everything. Felt the oneness. Felt the earth spinning in its orbit. I knew the earth and melted into the ground, though this time everything looked as it would through normal vision, except for the aliveness and brightness and newness of everything. I seem to understand or know that everything is freshly created in every moment." This is a powerful mystical experience. And it happened to a child at the age of 6. There's a powerful sense of oneness, a sense that the universe consists of some fundamental spiritual force or principle. Unfortunately, there was a slightly tragic aftermath to this experience, because he made the mistake of telling his parents about it. And he had a couple of similar experiences which he told his parents about. And his parents mentioned it to the doctor, who mentioned it to a psychiatrist. And you know the rest. He was prescribed medication, unfortunately. I always tell my students at university, never tell your parents about mystical experiences. But yeah, unfortunately, many psychiatrists, even now, are still unaware of the spiritual dimension of human experience, and any aberrational experiences, any unusual experiences, seen as a kind of pathology. So yeah, I think these are, in my view, these are very powerful arguments against constructivism, and they are very powerful arguments for fundamental commonalities in mystical experience, both within and outside traditions. One of the things I've done in my research is to compare extra-traditional awakening experiences or mystical experiences to traditional mystical experiences, and also the same with the ongoing state of wakefulness. And the similarities are very strong. Essentially, they are the same experiences interpreted in a different way. So just to conclude, my approach, I'm very appreciative of spiritual traditions. I've followed spiritual teachings myself at various times, and I still do. But I always think that spiritual awakening doesn't have to be interpreted in religious or even spiritual terms. It can be treated outside the context of any spiritual tradition. I think there is a common landscape of expansive human experience, which is explored and interpreted in different ways in different spiritual traditions. But the landscape pre-exists spiritual traditions and can be experienced without reference to them. But the great thing about spiritual traditions is that they offer structured ways of approaching this landscape, of exploring this landscape. They offer coherent interpretations of the landscape. Often when a person experiences this landscape outside the context of traditions, they can be, they feel slightly disorientated and confused. So that's that is the great benefit of spiritual traditions. So Ken Rose, whose work I admire, he's recently spoken of a new day for perennialism and the recovery of mystical essentialism. Like Ken Rose, I think the new day for perennialism lies in a more nuanced and qualified form of perennialism, which doesn't make such large claims. And it's also a movement away from the philosophical aspects, that is, a focus on doctrines, towards a more phenomenological or experiential approach. So that's what I call soft perennialism. And I've only summarized it briefly during this session. But if you want to look into my arguments in more detail, you can follow the further reading at the bottom of this slide. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all three presenters. I really hope that we can have a few minutes for asking questions and discussion, even though we're supposed to meet again at 5 o'clock for the next session. I'm guilty for having used up almost 15 minutes at the beginning of this session. So I don't want to steal all that time and not get back to the opportunity of people asking questions. I don't know if people do have questions now. Swamiji, we'll start with you.
I have a question for Alireza.
Yes, okay, can you go to the microphone? It's right there on your left. He has a question for Alireza.
Yeah, thank you to all three presenters. They're very interesting presentations, and I think they'll dovetail well with a number of other presentations. So regarding your presentation, Alireza, I thought your presentation was a very powerful critique of what philosophers of science now call scientism. My concern is that I got the sense that at certain points in your presentation, you were conflating or bordering on conflating what you call modern science with scientism. Because in some of the early slides, you're saying that modern science is committed to certain assumptions, which I take to be scientistic assumptions, which not all modern scientists would accept. And then toward the end of your presentation, you had a slide called Modern Science and Scientism, where you begin to make a distinction between modern science and scientism, but it's not clear to me what that distinction is. So if you could just clarify, what is the distinction between modern science and scientism?
You can grab the microphone, yeah. This one? Either one.
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, I did try to make a clear distinction between modern science, which in its own right is in fact a mode of knowledge, as opposed to scientism, which is essentially the claim that modern science is the source of truth. What happens is that very often the borderline, which is rather delicate, between the two, that is, between modern science, which is rather innocent if it stays within its own bounds, and scientism, the borderline is not always clear. And predominantly, when people talk about modern science, they have consciously or unconsciously, they do have scientific premises, which means that they would take modern science as the criteria of truth, meaning that it is capable of providing us with a knowledge of reality. So to your point, I made sure to defend modern science for what it is. I defended the fact that it is in fact a mode of knowledge. But when it comes to full knowledge of reality, I made sure that that phrase was in the statement when I criticized modern science. When it comes to full knowledge of reality, it is inadequate. So in other words, if the objective is to know just the phenomenal world, we have no qualms. We have no quarrel with modern science. But that is not usually what people are after. They're looking for ways of knowing reality or the full knowledge of reality through modern science. And that is where the distinction between modern science and scientism becomes critical, in fact, as you noted.
Maybe we can take another 1 or 2 questions. Go ahead.
Just have a question for Dr. Taylor, and there were just a couple of things that occurred to me. I mean, on the one hand, I would want to problematize the notion of sort of a neutral secular space, in a sense, right? Because in many ways, what we think of as sort of the secular, right? I mean, you look at the work of people like Alistair MacIntyre or Charles Taylor, right? And I mean, in many ways, it's a very specific secularity, right, to sort of a Western post-Christian society. So in that sense, I mean, it's a very specific apostasy, as it were. Even that shapes the way that people see their world. So in that sense, I would wonder, I mean, how would you respond if people are saying that nevertheless, even that, right, in some way colors people's spiritual experience, even if they have no personal, that is, individual experience of it, but nevertheless, I mean, sort of, you know, whether linguistically or sort of, there's still this deeper aspect of them, right? Even if they're totally enclosed in kind of the immanent frame, that, you know, they're not open to, or they think they're not open to the transcendent. Something breaks through, and that can be such a marvelous thing. And of course, you would hope and expect that it would be, right. I mean, if there is this intrinsic capacity, if it's something real and it's not some kind of cultural construct. So that's one consideration. And the other one that would come to mind, you want to say something? I just want to make sure I get the other bit, which is in the great traditions, right? I mean, you know, you sort of, like in Tibetan tradition, for example, there's this saying that, you know, study is like a patch, it will fall off, right? And that might be what you mean by doctrine. Experiences are like mist, they'll fade away, right? I mean, really, the core of it is, you know, a direct insight into one's own nature, and therefore the nature of reality that is salvific, or that is liberative. In that sense, I think I would be concerned. I mean, when you say don't make such grand claims, in a sense, like, are we, you know, foreclosing that possibility? And I think that's kind of the crux of what people seek in the great traditions is, you know, in a sense, like it's fine if it's sort of pleasurable experiences, if it's enhancement of sort of my self-construction in some way, you know, I'm making, do you know, but at the end of the day, right, how do we preserve that essential crux, which I think, you know, is really what people are after deep down.
Yeah, in terms of the first point, I mean, I think one of the great things is that even in secular societies with a materialist metaphysical paradigm, awakening experiences and mystical experiences still occur to people, to the very people who would least expect to have them, you know. And that's one of the problems I've found in my research, is that people sometimes repress mystical experiences because they don't know how to explain them within a materialist paradigm. And that's quite common, particularly in terms of very intense experiences. So, you know, in a sense, that in itself is an argument against constructivism, because the experiences are totally opposite to the kinds which would be constructed by the culture. And sometimes people are slightly confused by the experiences because they don't have an interpretive framework to make sense of them. And there was, particularly when people shift into an ongoing state of wakefulness, you know, it can be several years sometimes before they really understand what's happened to them, because it doesn't make sense in terms of materialism. And particularly here in the UK, it's a very secular culture. A lot of people are just, they're not atheists, they're not religious, they're just sort of in between. You know, they're just sort of disinterested in religion, and they've kind of passively absorbed a materialistic outlook, but they still have mystical experiences. In terms of the second question, maybe I should clarify that when I talk about experiences, I literally mean temporary experiences, which last for a few seconds or a few minutes or a few hours. But when I talk about the experience of wakefulness, that is not, in a sense, is not an experience because it's an ongoing state. It's a stable state which doesn't fade. So experiences can sometimes be misleading if they are temporary, but wakefulness is as an ongoing stable state. You know, in a sense, it's not an experience, and therefore, you know, it's not potentially delusional in the sense that I think you intended.
Everyone, I think we're going to have to bring the questioning to an end right now because we're already falling behind in the first session of this conference. So what I would like to propose is that we don't come back at 5, but we come back at 5:05. That would give us 20 minutes instead of 30 minutes, which is better than 15 minutes. So we can do that, and then we'll continue with the second session. My hearty thanks to all 3 of our presenters. It was wonderful to hear from all 3 of you. Let's have applause one more time.